I never thought a simple garden could turn into a full-blown neighborhood nightmare. But that's exactly what happened the day HOA Karen decided to play dictator. It all started on a sunny Saturday morning. My sister had just spent weeks tending to her backyard garden, a mix of colorful flowers, fresh vegetables, and a few herbs she loved to experiment with. The scent of basil and roses filled the air, and for a moment, everything felt peaceful. That peace lasted about 5 minutes. Out of nowhere, HOA Karen appeared, marching down the driveway like she owned the place. She was holding a clipboard, scribbling furiously, and glaring like a storm was coming. "Your garden violates HOA rules," she barked before my sister could even respond. "Those flowers are too tall. The bushes are uneven. You've crossed the line." I couldn't believe my ears. Who cared if the garden was a little wild? It wasn't affecting anyone. But Karen didn't care about logic, she cared about control. Things escalated fast. My sister tried to explain that she had already checked the HOA regulations and was within her rights. Karen didn't listen. She snapped her fingers like she was calling in reinforcements. Soon, a neighbor who worked in the HOA office appeared, nodding along with Karen's accusations. My sister's hands shook as she tried to defend herself, and I could see the panic rising in her eyes. The air felt heavy, like something was about to snap. Then Karen took it one step too far. She threatened to report my sister to the city for illegal landscaping if she didn't tear out half the garden immediately. That's when I stepped in, trying to reason with her. She has every right to her yard. "This is harassment," I said, keeping my voice steady. Karen just smirked and waved me off, clearly not expecting anyone to push back. At that moment, I realized things were no longer just a garden dispute. They were about to get ugly. My sister tried to stay calm, but Karen's aggression kept escalating, and soon, the shouting drew attention from the neighbors. Someone dialed 911, and within minutes, police arrived. I could feel the tension spike as the officers stepped between us and Karen, trying to prevent the situation from spiraling out of control. My sister's face was pale, her hands gripping the railing of the porch for support. The garden she loved had turned into a battlefield, and it was only the beginning. The police listened carefully, taking notes and asking questions, but Karen wasn't done. Her eyes were cold, her voice sharp as she insisted we were breaking the rules. That's when I knew this confrontation was going to make headlines. In our quiet little neighborhood, what happened next would shock everyone, and it all unfolded in front of the officers who had to step in to keep the peace. The moment the police arrived, I thought we might finally get some breathing room. But HOA Karen wasn't about to back down. Instead, she turned up the intensity, her voice cutting through the quiet of the neighborhood like a siren. "This garden is a disaster," she yelled, pointing at the carefully tended flowers as if they were evidence of a crime. "You're breaking the rules, and someone has to be held accountable." My sister stood frozen, gripping the porch railing, trying to steady her voice. "I followed all the HOA guidelines," she said, her words shaking but determined. "There's nothing wrong with my garden." Karen just smirked and shook her head, clearly enjoying the chaos she had created. It was obvious she wasn't here to find a solution. She wanted to intimidate and humiliate. The police officers stepped closer, trying to mediate. "Ma'am, we're asking you to calm down," one officer said firmly. Karen, however, ignored them entirely. She started pacing in the yard, ranting about rules and regulations that didn't even exist, rattling off clauses from the HOA handbook in a way that sounded more like a performance than actual enforcement. Neighbors began gathering, phones out, recording the escalating drama. It was turning into a viral spectacle right in front of us. And then, Karen did something I will never forget. She grabbed a clipboard and slammed it onto my sister's freshly planted flower bed, scattering dirt and petals everywhere. My sister's eyes welled up with tears, and I could see the shock ripple through the crowd. This wasn't just confrontation anymore. It was aggression, pure and simple. The officers immediately stepped in to restrain Karen, but she resisted, arguing and shouting that she was protecting the neighborhood. I could feel my anger rising, but I stayed calm, knowing that if I reacted, it could make things worse. My sister quietly began gathering the scattered plants, trying to salvage what remained. Meanwhile, the officers warned Karen that if she didn't leave, she could be arrested for disorderly conduct. That's when the real chaos began. Karen's ranting turned into full-blown yelling, drawing even more neighbors into the scene, and her threats escalated to implying legal action against us for defying the HOA. It was clear the police were the only reason the situation hadn't exploded completely. My sister was trembling, the garden she loved now partially destroyed, and I realized how dangerous obsession with control could become. Karen had taken a harmless garden and turned it into a battlefield, testing boundaries and daring anyone to stand up to her. The officers were firm, keeping her in check, but the tension lingered like smoke. By the end of that afternoon, it was obvious. Karen had gone too far. The police had to step in not once, but repeatedly, just to prevent further damage and escalation. And even as she was escorted off the property, her glare promised that this wasn't over. What happened next would push the confrontation to an entirely new level, and it would leave the neighborhood talking for months. The day after the garden incident, the neighborhood was buzzing. Word spread fast. Phones were blowing up with texts, neighbors stopping by, and even a few curious onlookers lingering near the property. My sister and I were still shaken. The memory of HOA Karen slamming her clipboard into the flowers fresh in our minds. It was hard to focus, knowing she could escalate at any moment. We decided to document everything. Photos of the damaged garden, videos from neighbors' phones, and even the police report were collected and organized. My sister wanted to show the HOA board that we weren't breaking any rules. But Karen had already started spinning her version of events, emailing neighbors, exaggerating the threats, and trying to paint us as the problem. It was clear she had no intention of letting this go quietly. Then the first legal threat arrived. A letter in a crisp envelope, bearing the HOA's logo, claimed we were in violation of community guidelines and demanded immediate compliance or face legal action. My sister and I exchanged worried glances. It wasn't just a personal attack anymore. It was official, and Karen's fingerprints were all over it. She had weaponized the HOA against us. We decided to consult a lawyer. The advice was clear. HOA Karen had overstepped her authority, and the police involvement worked in our favor. Any claim against us would likely be dismissed if we had proper documentation of the incident. But the lawyer also warned us that Karen wouldn't stop. She thrived on confrontation and had a reputation for pushing boundaries. We had to be prepared for the long haul. Meanwhile, Karen continued her campaign. She sent emails to neighbors, held informal meetings in her driveway, and even tried to intimidate my sister with more vague threats about fines and penalties. But this time we were ready. We had evidence, witnesses, and the knowledge that we were within our rights. Each time Karen tried to escalate, we stayed calm, letting the facts speak louder than her dramatics. The most surprising twist? Some neighbors who had quietly observed the earlier chaos started siding with us. They shared their own experiences with Karen, stories of intimidation and unreasonable demands. Slowly, the tide was turning. What began as a garden dispute had now become a larger conversation about abuse of power and the importance of standing up for your rights. By the end of the week, it was clear. HOA Karen had underestimated us. But she wasn't done. The next confrontation would take us even closer to the brink, testing patience, courage, and the limits of neighborhood diplomacy. The battle over a garden had become a battle for respect, fairness, and sanity in our own backyard. The tension in the neighborhood reached its peak a few days later. HOA Karen had made it clear she wasn't going to stop. Her emails, her driveway meetings, even her thinly veiled threats continued. But this time we were ready. My sister and I had prepared every piece of evidence, photos, videos, the police report, and witness statements from neighbors who had seen her aggression firsthand. This wasn't just about a garden anymore. It was about standing up to someone who believed rules were a weapon, not a guideline. The showdown began when Karen showed up unannounced at our property, clipboard in hand, looking ready for another confrontation. My sister and I stayed calm, refusing to engage in her theatrics. The moment she started ranting about supposed violations, we presented our evidence. Neighbors had gathered too, filming and supporting us, and Karen's confident smirk started to falter. She realized her usual intimidation tactics weren't going to work this time. Things escalated quickly. Karen tried to argue, citing vague HOA rules, but our documentation left no room for misinterpretation. The police officer who had been involved in the first incident even appeared, confirming her prior misconduct and the fact that the original garden incident had already been investigated. Karen's face went pale as her authority crumbled around her. She was used to everyone else backing down, but now she had no leverage. The HOA board intervened shortly after, reviewing the evidence and speaking to witnesses. Karen's aggressive behavior, false claims, and intimidation tactics were all exposed. The board issued a formal reprimand, warning her that any further harassment would result in suspension from the HOA and potential legal action. The neighbors watched in quiet satisfaction as someone who had long ruled through fear was finally being held accountable. The garden, once a battlefield, was slowly restored. My sister replanted the damaged flowers, but this time, the community rallied behind her. Neighbors who had previously stayed silent now offered help, encouragement, and even tips to make the garden thrive. What had started as a simple dispute had transformed into a lesson about courage, unity, and standing up against bullying, no matter how powerful or seemingly untouchable the aggressor might appear. In the end, HOA Karen was left humiliated, powerless, and unable to continue her campaign of intimidation. The police had done their part. The HOA board had acted responsibly, and the community had witnessed firsthand that accountability matters. My sister's garden was more than just plants now. It was a symbol of resilience, justice, and the importance of refusing to back down when confronted with unreasonable authority. And as we stood in the garden, sunlight glinting off the fresh blooms, we knew this victory wasn't just for us. It was for anyone who had ever felt powerless in the face of someone like HOA Karen. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss any of our crazy HOA battles. Smash the like button if you're team. Stand up for your rights, and drop a comment below telling us what you would do if HOA Karen came after your garden.